Hello, welcome back to the David Watson podcast. Today I spoke with Dr. Anthony D'Agostino, and I've probably said that wrong, but he wrote what's described as a provocative book, Prejudice, Racism and Tribalism, a primer for white people. And we had a very interesting discussion, and when he got to politics we had a very interesting debate, but I really did appreciate his time, his courtesy, and he says some really interesting things. And I genuinely have a listen to it, because if there's nothing I love more, it's people that provoke thought and make you have to think about the way you think. And he does an excellent job of that. And I'm very grateful to him for giving me his time. Hello, welcome to the David Watson podcast. How are you doing?
Pretty well so far. I'm alive and well and happy about that.
As we just discussed. And just quickly and randomly, how is the weather in Chicago?
The weather in Chicago right now is really, rather good. I mean, it's upper 40s, perhaps, weak sunlight.
Yeah.
Yesterday, I think it was snowing here, but and not, and not uncontrollably. So most of the snow is melted now.
Oh, right. Okay. Because you guys get heavy snow, don't you?
We can get some very heavy snows, but usually this early in the season is more rare.
Okay.
And it really wasn't all that heavy, and with the temperatures in the 40s, it melts fairly quickly.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So it's kind of just warning you that it'll be here soon.
Pardon?
The weather's kind of just warning you that there'll be snow along soon
Yes,
enough.
there will be snow one day, certainly.
So you've written a few books, haven't you?
I've written two actually, and one is a good book. I guess we're going to talk a bit about today:
Yeah.
racism and prejudice. I wrote another book, sort of the history of our hospital here in suburban Chicago. It's called the Curious Case of the Alexian Brothers Behavioral Health Hospital, and it's a discussion about funding of psychiatry over the last 40, 50 years, and the ups and downs of practicing psychiatry in the world, in the United States. So it's about our hospital, but our hospital as a kind of model for how things have gone, in my profession. I'm a psychiatrist, by the way.
And do you feel that that's gone well, or it could be done better?
Well, I mean, everything can be done better, but for a good number of years, I mean, before Obamacare, it was very difficult to get psychiatric benefits funded.
Yeah.
Insurance companies could get away with just about everything. I think since Obamacare, funding has improved as more people have sort of accepted the notion that they might encounter a psychiatric problem in their lifetime,
Mm-hmm.
or their children, or their parents, or their relatives. So yeah, I think things have improved, but it was kind of a struggle for a while, and I write about that.
Yeah. Okay. So the second book then, which is the one that, like you said, that you want to talk about, is the description that was sent to me, or the line that was used: one author's unique and provocative book, Prejudice, Racism and Tribalism, a primer for white people, explores these issues one at a time and hopes to put the readers on a healthier path. And as I read that, I was just like, I wonder how many things are getting triggered when people read that.
Well, I do have a Facebook author page, and what it triggers is a lot of hate mail, actually.
I can
A
imagine.
lot, a lot of people just don't like the title, and they make assumptions about what I say in the book based on the title, and they don't like what they're assuming I'm writing about, and I get comments like, well, why don't you write a primer for Black people? And
Yeah.
of course, I'm a white person and I don't feel comfortable speaking about black people, so I mean, I have a reason for what I write, and I think it makes sense, but it's kind of hard to explain. For example, I try to discuss the differences between races or prejudice, racism, and tribalism. And I think I was inspired to write the book, to tell you the truth. I mean, this is my inspiration, was the first election of Donald Trump as president. That was sort of my inspiration. I was, at the time, I was writing my first book, so I really didn't get to it until a little bit later. But I found it a fascinating um, examination of issues like prejudice, racism, and tribalism. And so I thought that I would write about that at some point, and then I finally got around to doing it. I think prejudice is something that almost everyone has. I try to make the point that you can't grow up in life, you can't be
Mm.
educated, you can't live in a culture for the first 18 years of your life and not have some inborn prejudices. You simply have to. You cannot be
Yeah,
without that. So I see that as a natural aspect of being a human being, and you're forced to sort of re-examine them from time to time. But much of many things we just don't think about. We just automatically see the world the way we see it, and unless something happens that makes us question that, we're gonna have our prejudices. And so what I say is, I try to address the question: is every white person a racist? Well, then you have to define what a racist is. And so I try to make the argument that you can have plenty of prejudices about, let's say, black people or Mexicans or whatever you want. Um, but you're not necessarily a racist, because I think it is natural to just have inborn prejudice, especially if you don't see people very much. So if you
mm.
live in a world, as a white person, I grew up in a world that you know that really didn't have a lot of black people in it. I mean, I heard about them,
Mm.
but I didn't interact with black people on a day-to-day basis. I lived in a world, that I went to, Catholic schools all of my life. So the first, 12, actually 15 years of my life, I was in Catholic schools. I was meeting these people. So I didn't, there weren't a lot of black people in my neighborhood. And there weren't a lot of black people, and not a black people are Catholics, in fact. So you get a skewed view,
Mm.
I'm sorry about that. You get a skewed view of, these people because you just don't, rub shoulders with them on a day-to-day basis. So of course, you grow up with certain prejudices, and you need to re-examine them. So what I do is I try to, it's a primer in the sense that I'm saying I'm going to talk to the people who are like me,
Yeah.
and I'm going to talk to people who are like me, and they will understand how I, develop my own prejudices, and I'll ask them to sort of question, why do you think the way you do? Why do you ask the questions that you ask? And so that's what I try to do. I try to define racism very narrowly. So, if you define racism as prejudice against people, other people, then, you end up with a world full of racists
Yeah.
because, we're all sort of prejudiced against one another in some way. So I argue that you have to narrow that definition down to make it rational, to make it understandable. So I, examined several definitions of racism that I read about, and I came up with one that I think I like the best.
Mm.
And that is that racism is prejudice against somebody of a different race, but where you're in a position to exercise power over them. So, I just choose to define racism that way. So, like, for example, if we're looking at a football game, I like to watch football on Sunday, and I see these helmets that say end racism on the back of the helmet. And I say to myself, gee, I wonder what that means.
Yeah,
Does that mean we should all love one another? Well, yeah. I mean, that's nice, but you know, I like reading history, and I'm a person of the world, and I realize that's never going to happen.
mm,
So when you say end racism, is that just a good feeling we should all somehow develop? That's nonsense. So, in a state like, Florida or Texas, they can make a law that says you can't teach like real American history.
yeah.
Like you have to limit your teaching of slavery to only whatever the good aspects. I don't know what the good aspects were, but whatever they were, that's all you can teach. So if you take racism as we individual human beings should all be nice to each other, I mean, that's a pleasant and, it's a pleasant but useless
Yeah.
concept. If you say racism is what goes on in the state legislature in Florida or Texas, where they exercise power over other people and the way they do things, then that sounds more like racism. So I'll take that as my definition. So I'm really saying to people who are like me, let's take a look at these different definitions and what they mean. Um, Tribalism I believe, is an inborn human instinct. I
Definitely.
believe we developed that, over years and years of evolution. And I think it's useful because it helped people who are like one another, who share similar values or similar family,
Well,
perhaps,
yeah, I'd say it
uh,
was essential at one
to
point.
survive.
Yeah.
Right. It's a survival instinct. So you're not going to end tribalism, but you redefine it maybe in different ways and looking at it in somewhat different ways. Um, the other it's sort of like, okay, white folks, if you haven't thought about this in a while, I'm going to go over these different definitions and tell you what I think about these different things. So um, I try to address the issue of the difference between guilt and shame. Like, what's white privilege? What is that? How shall we define that? And I think I try to define it in a way that makes sense. Um, and so I realize other people, like a black person says you have white privilege. White people are kind of insulted by that. They see that as a
Well, like you
sort
say,
of a
because you have to, for something to be a privilege, you have to be able to define what I have that you're not allowed.
right,
And if you can't do that, then I don't have a privilege that you don't have.
right. I define, for example, I give the example. If you are born into a family where your family income's $500,000 a
Yeah.
year, you're going to probably have more privilege
Mm.
than if you're born into a family that makes $40,000 a year. You're going to have more privilege because we're going to define privilege as, advantages and the
Yeah.
advantages that come with money. So you have, and so don't be offended when people say, privilege, because we can define what that is in certain ways. The other issue is, okay, so as a white person, do I have more privilege than a that's a black person for say, or a
Yeah.
Mexican person? Um, um, well, I probably do.
How
One of
so?
those has to do with income. If median family income in white families is higher than in black families, then yeah, I mean, if you want to define that as just the financial ability to get more education, buy more things, learn more things. So yes, you have that privilege.
But it,
Is that is that bad? I mean, are you a
but
bad
is that
person
a
because you
privilege or
have
is that earned? Because
that?
is that a privilege or is that earned? Because you as an individual, as a highly sort of decorated psychologist, you're going to do better than most people, regardless of where they're from or what race they are.
Of course,
You know,
of course.
was
And I'm not going to run away from that.
no, but the reason I
You
say
know,
that is because I'm 50 years old, live in the UK, and live with my mum. So what's my privilege?
okay. Yes. Well,
Do you see what I'm saying? I'm not. Like I say, to me, the way that I would define privilege is, and bearing in mind, I think one of the things people have to be very clear on, the issues that America has are often confused with global issues, and it's not the truth.
right.
America has its own unique issues, largely because of the issues that followed on from slavery, and
Yeah, true, true.
and the human rights that followed in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s. So they're unique to the United States of America,
Some of
because
them, yes.
yeah, but they don't come under prejudice. Do you know what I mean? Because there were plenty of white people in America throughout all of those times who were supporting black rights.
Yes,
So
yes,
actually, the white person next to you could have been your best friend.
true, true. Um, so anyway, I take pains to try to define these different aspects of things, and let's take another look at that. And then I raised the question of, as far as the teaching of history, why do we not want to know that?
Mm,
Why would we want to know the truth about, what things were? Yeah, some people seem to be very sensitive. So there's a movement in the United States right now to protect white children from having their feelings hurt. I
yeah,
mean, that's a little
yeah. We have the same
puzzling.
problem in the UK.
Okay, so I just sort of raised the issue of, as I was growing up and I was learning about slavery, I never really thought, I never had a personal sort of reaction to it. I just read history, I read lots of history, European history,
Mm,
Asian history. So, I just don't know why I would feel badly about talking about that sort of thing. Now, if you if you have a highly invested, I'm a white person and I am more valued or I should have more value in the world than other people just because, my ancestors, created the modern industrial world. I mean, think about, and I ask folks to
mm.
think about that, that someone in the past made life, easier for you, but you didn't do that. You didn't contribute that. Some other person basically did that, and we inherited some of that. And I'm happy, and I'm not really ashamed to say I'm sort of happy that I inherited whatever advantages I got. But does that make me in effect more deserving on the day that I'm born? Let's think about that, because I really don't see it. So if somebody tells me there's a point in the book where we have a program in the United States called Finding Your Roots. It's a wonderful program. Henry Louis Gates is the host, and what they do is they look at the ancestry of usually celebrities
Yeah,
of
we have
one
a
kind or
similar
another.
program in the UK.
Right. And one of these celebrity programs was a young performer on a popular U.S. show that's been very popular for like 40 or 50 years here called uh, Saturday Night Live, I think it's
Okay.
right. And there's a performer on there who's of Mexican ancestry, and so they traced her ancestry back um, to actually Cortez, not Cortez himself, but some of the people who came with Cortez when he conquered Mexico 500 years ago.
Yeah.
And it was interesting to see her response when she discovered that she was, a descendant of a conquistador, and it sort of, it almost looked like she was embarrassed and ashamed. And so I discuss that in the book, and how rational is that? This is
Yeah.
the fellow that came over with Cortez was her 12th great grandfather, 12th great grandfather.
Yeah.
Now, I think it's an amazing program that they were even able to trace her ancestry back that far. But apparently, from the area of Mexico where she was born, they were able to go to the local church and go back
Yeah.
500 years of her relatives, which I thought was great because my relatives came here in 1908 and 1909, and I know nothing about, my ancestry before that. And
So
then
where did they come from
all
then?
the period, pardon,
Where did they come from then?
they came from Italy, central Italy.
Central Italy.
One from my paternal grandparents came from the Naples area, and my maternal grandparents came from um, uh, an area of Italy called the Abruzzi,
Okay.
which I think is a little like Appalachia
Yeah,
here
yeah,
in
yeah.
the United States, kind
Okay.
of very poor, mountainous, rural. And
Because
I know my parents, they couldn't read it. My grandparents really couldn't read and write when they came here, so they were pretty poor. And I was able to go to college. My father learned to read and write pretty quickly. Things went well.
but
They could have
because
gone
that's the
either.
funny thing, isn't it? Is because you can be accused of white privilege, but if you're going to go into your heritage, your
Right,
family would have left Italy because of poverty.
right.
And when they arrived in America, they probably realised they were more poor than when they were in Italy, and suddenly had to figure it out.
Right. They had to figure it out, and they couldn't read and write. I know that um, only because I when I was very young, my grandfather took me to a local lawyer, and we lived in an area called Little Italy,
Yeah,
and he took me to a lawyer, and the lawyer wrote the letter that he sent to his relatives in Italy. So I mean, he couldn't even write his own letter.
yeah,
And I was kind of surprised because I was 7 years old or thereabouts at the time, and I could read and write, and he couldn't. It was just sort of like, well, America, and great,
yeah.
and I was happy about that. But again, when we look at there's this Mexican performer, from the Saturday Night Live program, and as she learned about her ancestry and her history, the emotional reactions that she went through, I just thought that was really interesting because, um, there's nothing she could do about her 12th grade
No, nothing.
grandfather. There's nothing much you can really do about it. And she probably really doesn't have too many of his genes anymore, by this time. But then he goes into the part where, what percentage of her genome, when he goes into analyzing genomes, well, what percentage of her genome is European versus indigenous? And you could tell when he told her that she was 25% indigenous, that means she was 75% European. Um, there was a certain embarrassment about, being European. And she took pride in the 25% of her indigenous. And then he lays it on her. By the way, you're 2% West African.
Mm,
She goes, and a smile comes on her face, and she thinks, oh, wow, I'm 2% West African. That's good. And Mr. Gates says to her, or Dr. Gates says, well, yeah, but that probably means one of your grandfathers owned a slave.
yeah.
Oh, and it becomes so that you can see the ups and downs of all these
I think, yeah,
historical things that she has absolutely no control over.
I think
So
what,
I talk about that.
yeah, I was going to say, I think one of the issues they have is they don't know European history either. Because I think they have this idea that people wandered free and owned land. And it's just like, no, we were enslaved as well. And if we weren't enslaved, we were probably at war because Europe was at war for about 2,000 years. You know,
Of course, Europe was always at war,
mm,
and I even in the book talk a little bit about my understanding of the history of England, the various conquerors,
yeah,
of England, and how. these people, they had intense feelings about one another. And I talk a little bit, I was raised in a Catholic school, and when I was very young, we left the Italian neighborhood, we moved into another neighborhood that was a little different, and everybody in the school was Irish. So I learned a lot about Irish history, and I discovered that England made a lot of attempts to suppress the Irish language, Gaelic, and so I talk about, this is what happens when people
But
conquer one another.
I
They
have
don't always.
I have an interesting story because I am half Irish. My mum is Irish. My mum is Irish.
Ah,
My dad is English.
right.
And I remember talking to one of my grandmother's brothers, so my great uncle, because I have relatives that live in Chicago from Ireland. They immigrated to
Ah,
Chicago, and one of them used to often go and see a lady called who was my aunt Nancy, or great aunt Nancy, and her brother Jim used to go out and see her, and would often go out to Chicago, work for sort of 6-7 months on his visa, and go back to Ireland. You know, now he's Irish. He's only got an Irish passport, and he would tell me these stories about when he'd go to Chicago. If he went to some of the Irish bars, they would not talk to him because he did not speak Gaelic. He said, but none of these guys had ever stepped foot in Ireland because if they did, they would know, especially in Jim's time, nobody spoke Gaelic. They all speak English.
no, no. I mean, Gaelic was pretty much stamped out, yeah,
Mm.
hundreds of years
Yeah,
ago.
hundreds of.
Um,
And
right,
you will find very few Irish people anywhere in Ireland that speak Gaelic. They all speak English.
right, right. But I examine that as part of conquest
Mm.
because, in the United States, I would say that the Europeans conquered the Native Americans. I mean, that's how
Mm.
I speak
Yeah,
about that when we talk about Native Americans in my book. They were conquest. So we can argue about whether that was a good or a bad thing, but it was a fact of
it
life. I
is
mean, it just
exactly
happened.
a fact of life
Right.
from what 400-500 years ago.
Right, right. So, I mean, some of the conquests were at the end of the 19th century, and but anyway, I try to discuss that, but put it into context. I'm not here to, and some of the hate mail I get,
Yeah,
on my my Facebook site, it's like I'm going to bash white people, and people say, well, why should I read your book? I know what you're going to say, that type of thing, and
yeah.
I don't think they know what I'm going to say, but
I
I
do
think it
I
would.
do I do sympathise because obviously when the spec came through to would I talk to you, I was just like, I'll talk to you because I think it's going to be uncomfortable, and it's not that I enjoy having uncomfortable conversations because so I've immediately gone into an area of prejudice because it's just like, but I feel that I should never. If I have a podcast and I'm not as prepared to at least have a conversation with everybody, then I should stop having a
Right,
podcast because
sure,
I don't know. And I'm a great believer in when people focus on what they do have in common, you realize you can get on with just about everybody. But we seem to be in this weird world where people are focusing on their differences. And at the same time as focusing on their differences, they're assuming that because you and I are both white, we must be the same people.
right,
And white
right,
people do the same about Mexicans, Mexicans do the same about black people do the same about everybody else. And we're all, like you say, it comes back to tribalism. But if you're
right,
somebody that grew up in a multicultural neighborhood and still live in that multicultural neighborhood with the same guys that you went to school with, you will still be tribal the minute somebody of any color walks down your street that you're not familiar with.
right, right.
But that's not
Absolutely,
racism.
absolutely. No, no, it's not. That's why I take pains to define
Yeah.
what racism is.
It's a
I
difficult
say,
one.
well, here's what I think it is. Let's call racism this, but let's not call everything racism.
Yeah.
Is it possible for? And I even examine, what would I have done? So I examine the possibility that okay, it's 1832. I inherit a plantation in Georgia. I have 100 slaves. Now, my whole family the wealth of my family, the respect of my family. This is part of a local culture. Would I, upon inheriting this plantation, would I have freed all the slaves?
Mm.
And I say, well, I like to think that I would, but uh, I don't think I would have, because I would have lived in that milieu. I would have been taught to think in that particular milieu. Plus, I mean, this is my family's wealth, so I'm going to be challenged. I'm going to have anxieties, but in all honesty, folks, I think I probably wouldn't. And then I ask myself another question: what if all of my slaves were white people? Would I free them at that point? And then I think about it back and forth and I say, well, I probably would plan on doing it sometime in the future, but I probably wouldn't at that moment in time. So I examine the behavior of people at the time, and then I ask myself, would I have fought for South Carolina in the Civil War if I was a citizen, a white citizen of South Carolina? And I come to the conclusion that, I'm not, I'm not the world's most virtuous human being. I probably would have,
Well,
and so, I try to approach it, from the point of view of, you live as part of a culture, you're part of a tribal culture. Do you just, I mean, unless you just hate everybody, the chances are you're going to probably behave a lot like those people behave. And so I try to, I'm not here to castigate people who lived 150 or 200 or 500 years ago. I'm here to say, let's be realistic about what we're
well,
talking about here.
here's an interesting kind of take on that, because and this is, like I say, this is why history is important, because people seem to define their history by color or by race and not realize that every country was doing something. And the reason I think that's
Of course.
important, because when you realize that everybody was doing something, you realize that you actually could have been the perpetrator or you could have been the victim, and you don't know. And
Sure.
I don't know if you've ever heard of them. There's a group called, there were 6 agricultural labourers, and they were called the Tolpuddle Martyrs. And they were arrested in Tolpuddle in Dorset, England. And I'll just read a little bit from Wikipedia, if I may. And it's the Tolpuddle Martyrs were 6 agricultural labourers from the village of Tolpuddle in Dorset, England, who were arrested and tried in 1834 for swearing a secret oath as members of a friendly society led by George Lovelace. And the group had formed this friendly society of agricultural labourers during a labour dispute over wage cuts that reduced their income to near starvation levels. Such unions were technically legal, but the British government, wary of organised labour, invoked an obscure 1797 law against unlawful oaths. The men were convicted and sentenced to penal transportation in Australia, and it only because of mass protests led by Lord John Russell, they were returned, because it was a maritime law and it was illegal. But this was the government, because these guys were like, look, if you don't pay us properly, we're starving to death. We won't be able to work. And they chained themselves to a tree. And yeah, and they got taken to Australia, to a penal colony. And it was like several years before going through Parliament and everything. They were arrested in 1834 and returned to England between 1837 and 1839. So this idea that it happened to everybody and anybody, it was a rough time, and people, the same sort of corruptions that people talk about today still existed then. And it's, when you look at history, the rich diversity of it, there's also a rich unfairness to it. And if you were from the wrong place or the wrong time, for want of a better word, you were screwed.
Right. No, that's true, and what I try to do is just sort of examine some of those historical things. So there's a great deal about history, a great deal about my understanding of how history has developed over the years. why Columbus, Columbus, um, when I grew up in an Italian neighborhood. Well, really, from birth to six, I lived in this more or less exclusively Italian neighborhood in Chicago. And then I moved, and that's when I met all my Irish friends when I moved
Yeah.
into my new school. But the community there bought a statue of Christopher Columbus, and they paid for it themselves, and they put it in their local park. It's a public park; it's not
Yeah.
a private park. But anyway, this was probably in the 1930s, maybe even the 1920s. And it's been there for a long time. And then recently, there was a group of people decided that Columbus was a bad person, and we couldn't have his, so they were desecrating the statue or whatever. So it's been removed. It's been taken away. There was another Columbus statue in Grant Park downtown in Chicago. So both of those were removed because people were protesting against Columbus. And what Columbus did was he introduced white people into the into the Western Hemisphere, I guess. So, and I try to talk about, is that a wise thing to do? And I think when the Italian community bought the statue and paid for it, I think they were feeling that they were being discriminated against,
Yeah.
and they used it as a source of pride. Look
Yeah.
at our guy discovered the place, and
Mm.
so it wasn't like racial domination or anything like killing off all the Indians. It
Yeah. It
was
was a
just
symbol of
a
hope.
community pride type
Yeah.
of thing. Right, right. And so, and here it is like 80 years later, people are demanding they have the statue removed. So I sort of examine it from both points of view. And I think, the Italians in the United States and in Chicago, I mean, they become, affluent people as a rule. And so it's not personal anymore. It's not a
Mm.
thing where, well, we've got to have this, or this is a validation of my existence. Nah, I mean, we're pretty mainstream, I think. And yet you have to look at it from the point of view of both sides of the fence here, and how shall we look at it? So I try to, get white folks to look at it, from different perspectives and see. So if people are that offended, fine, I'm okay with them taking it away. But at some point, we should stop and think about why we're doing these various things. And The other aspect of the book that I talk about is that I think that the ability to exploit white the prejudices that most of us white people have, the ability to exploit those prejudices are probably profitable for some people.
Yes.
So you have to look at, for example, we had this one of Joe Biden's initiatives was to lower the price of insulin for people who were on Medicare. So he lowered it to a point where the most you can pay is $35 a month in addition to whatever insurance. So it's not that you're paying only 35, but you can't spend more than $35. And you have to understand that you need insulin. I'm a physician.
Yeah.
And I understand that you need insulin to live, or not go blind, or not have your feet fall off
Mm.
if you don't use
Yeah.
insulin. So what has been happening when it's $700 or $800 a month, what happens is we see patients don't use insulin, or they use less than they should, or because it's just too expensive. And yet, when and every country in the world, not just Britain, but every modern country in the world has some way of controlling the price of drugs.
Mm.
But in the United States, we don't. So we sort of let drug companies, charge what they want. So I point out in the book that of the 17 of the 20 top selling drugs in this country, the drug companies make more money selling these 17 drugs in the United States than they make in all of the rest of the world. So here we are, 330 million people.
Yeah.
They make more money selling their drugs to 330 million people than they make selling it to the other 7.5 billion people in the world. So why can't we take a look at that? Well, the reason is that the people who are voting for this sort of thing are also, people who are pretty good at exploiting white prejudice. So, like in this last election that we just had, there were 30,000, pardon me, there were 30,000 advertisements about Kamala Harris facilitating sex change in a person in the California prison system.
Mm.
And you wonder, why why is that an important aspect of life? In this country, we're really big on owning guns, and we shoot each other with great facility, every day.
Mm.
There are more people being shot and killed with guns in this country than probably all of Europe on any given day.
But
That's because,
but
we love our
in
guns.
I think UK still has the highest statistic in Europe, if not the world, for stabbings.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Well,
getting rid of
just because,
guns, they just replace them with knives. We have a
right,
massive
but
knife problem in the UK.
yeah, but as a physician, I know it's much harder to kill somebody with a knife than with a gun. It's much
Yeah,
easier.
yeah,
So we probably have more deaths. So I sort of asked myself the question, well, if you don't like, you think black people are, too uppity, and if you think that liberals are going to take your guns away, and if you don't like, too many Mexican immigrants, then you're going to vote for the guy that's going to control all of those things for you. Except that guy is going to go back to Congress and vote against the $35 insulin. He's going to vote against, the union you belong to. He's going to vote against, any kind of control on the price of drugs. So you sort of have to decide what's in your best interest. And, I guess Americans are deciding that they really want their guns, and
no,
they don't like other people getting too much of an advantage in life,
no.
and
I think where the Democrats went massively wrong is Donald Trump went on all the podcasts and didn't have.
yes,
He went on several podcasts, not just Joe Rogan's. He went on Theo Vaughn's. I've forgotten the other American comedians he went on, and he allowed all of them to ask him whatever he wanted, and he didn't control any of the scripts. And if you look at Donald Trump's history with black people, he actually has an incredibly good relationship with them. If you look at some of the things he did, like he turned up to court for Michael Jackson. He supported the release of Nelson Mandela. There's a lot of things he did in the black community in and around New York. But bearing in mind, you can't be a billionaire property developer without being ruthless. So I certainly wouldn't want to be his enemy. But
right,
he has a lot of things that was. I had a podcast the other day with somebody, and we were talking about just where people like when Elon Musk got Twitter and he released the Twitter files, and it actually proved that people just made up stories and people deleted things they didn't like him saying and said he said something else. CNN admitted to actually lying about him and making up stories and re-editing pieces to make it sound like he said things he didn't do. And the problem with that, and Mark Zuckerberg, I need to be careful because I might not have this factually correct, but when he was on Joe Rogan, was talking about some of the pressures he got off some government agencies and institutions about what he could and couldn't put on Facebook. And the problem with that is, regardless of how good or bad you are, you end up in a position where people don't trust you. But you've got Donald Trump going on everything and actually just admitting some of his flaws. I watched a few of his podcasts, and I've forgotten the name of the guy. He's an Indian comedian, and my apologies, I don't remember his name. And he actually said, do you not think that sometimes when you open your mouth, you're just upsetting people and you're gaslighting them, and could you not actually just be a little bit more careful of how you say things? And Donald Trump was like, no, I understand, you're right, and I'm wrong. And he then even made a joke about it. He says, and I'm going to try to do better, and when I do, I'm going to think about you and the way you've spoken to do. And the thing is, even if you think he's acting, he's demonstrating humility to people, and he's allowing people with no script, no preparation, to say, you really upset me when you did that. And I've looked at some of your policies and they're pretty good. I like some of them. I don't like all of them. But really what I don't like about you is you. And I think you need to do better. And he was holding his hands up and saying, yeah, you're right. I do need to do better.
Well, I think I might have a slightly different outlook on things like that. For example, he spent a lot of time saying that he won the last election.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And how do you denigrate the whole? Now this time around, we're in 2020. The Democrats were very adept at massive voter fraud everywhere because he actually won by a landslide. And this time around, the Democrats somehow didn't succeed at massive voter fraud. I mean, suddenly there's no massive voter fraud. Isn't that sort of odd? So I think that when you set up a situation, where you have, thousands and thousands of people trying to, to interfere with the certification of voting, you're basically saying that um, I'm really more important than the traditions and the voting status of the country, and that those of you that agree with me that these other people are trying to muscle in, and we really we want to get rid of them. For example, the white supremacists are all they're all crazy about him, because obviously he gives, the white supremacist message very well. And I think they see Donald Trump as a kind of the last opportunity for, white folks
What white supremacist message did he give?
Well, let me ask you this. Well, first of all, he talks about other people as garbage. And
Yeah.
it was, one of the things where, the folks in this place were, garbage. Um, but they were all, extremely supportive of him, and saw this as really a great victory. Um, and they were willing to overthrow the government if he gave the signal. Give the signal. We have arms, across the river, across the Potomac. We will overthrow the government for you if you just signal. Now, I think that would not have gone well, and I think that it would not have gone over, but he was certainly willing to, at the very last moment, replace the attorney general if the attorney general would agree to suppress all the voting machines. So you really can't, so when you have people where he's saying, let's stop all the vote counting, let's stop the vote counting after 11 o'clock at night. If I'm still winning at 11 o'clock, I declare victory. And he wanted the
But did he
Justice
actually say that?
Department to suppress, yes, to suppress the voting machines, to stop the voting. I think that's not a nice thing. I would call that an anti-democratic move. And I think that's why he got such support from the white supremacy groups, because he's the only one who's actually willing to do that.
Yeah, but the thing is, though, he won he won by such a landslide. That's like a massive, an
Well,
unexpected landslide.
no, he was 51% of the vote.
Yeah, yeah, but if you look at the demographic across America of how many states became red,
Yes. Yeah,
that it's
absolutely. Yes.
he smashed the
Absolutely.
Democrats almost into non-existence because it's we had the same problem in the UK that you guys have in America when we had Brexit. If you look at the Brexit vote, it was split by a million, just over a million people, right? But when you split the demographic of the areas that voted to leave Europe, it was 70% of the country. And when we had all of the farcical sort of situations where, and something I'll say first as well about Brexit is both sides, sets of politicians, whether you were a Brexit supporter or a Remain supporter, and the media did a terrible job of actually discussing the issues and the problems, and where some of the hatred was coming from, where some of the prejudice were coming from, and where some of the lies were coming from. They just turned it into who hates who the most debate. And it wasn't helpful to anyone in the country at all. But it was very closely run in terms of numbers, but not by demographic. Like 70% of the country voted to leave. And when we ended up with several like leadership challenges with the Conservative Party, and eventually Boris Johnson became the leader. When we then had the next election and Boris Johnson was the head of the Brexit Party that wanted to leave,
Yeah.
he won 70% of the vote, if not more. It was the largest landslide for a Conservative government against a Labour government in Conservative history. But if you look at the numbers will tell you something different. And that's because it's the large metropolitan areas of the UK that were voting to remain. And I think that was
Well,
some of the problems, that's some of the issues that America has, is you get these large like metropolitan areas of high population and they're voting for one thing and the rest of the country, it's not what they want.
right. No, that's exactly true. I'm just saying that when you have somebody who is willing to suppress voting machines and is willing to, at the very last minute, change the attorney general from one person to another because he's willing to suppress the voting
Mm.
machines, and he's willing to,
But
I
was
mean,
that the
back
election
the
he
way
lost?
into,
Was that the
pardon,
previous election that he lost to Biden? Or are you talking
yeah,
about?
he lost. He lost in 2020.
Yeah,
Yes,
because he
but
didn't
his
do any of that
willingness,
for this one, though, did he?
his willingness to do that to the country is, to me, a problem. A
But
problem.
but do you not? And Ben, I have to be very clear because I'm not an American, so I've no skin
Sure,
in the game. Do you know what I mean?
sure.
It's um, the because when they were trying to take him to court, and it was eventually the Supreme Court that stepped in and said, "You're not charging him. He hasn't done anything unlawful. You're not. This is, no pun intended, but trumped up charges." And you're not, because even
Well,
Deutsche Bank.
we disagree on that because I think trying to overthrow an election is a
No, I
serious
mean
thing.
about when he was taken to court in New York over a loan from the bank, and the bank actually sat in the court. Deutsche Bank sat in the court and said, "We've got no problem with Donald Trump. We
Well,
know."
but he was convicted in New York. He was
Yeah, but
convicted
they
in New
tried to
York.
make the charges more than they were, and the Supreme Court stepped in and said, "You're not doing that. He's got no case to
Oh,
answer."
that could be, but he's, he was convicted on, in a jury of his peers of 34 felonies. So he was, found the defamation suit against him by that woman. I can't remember her name. Where she got a $5 million judgment because the jury obviously believed that he had,
Yeah, yeah.
sexually
He
assaulted.
had, you know,
And then he kept saying the same thing over and over again. Then he got an $80 million judgment after that because he disregarded what the court was asking him to do, which the court, it would ask every person to do. It was a jury found him guilty. He his his foundation was found to be fraudulent.
hmm
So, my sense that um,
But then how do you counter that with Hunter Biden laptop being suppressed and the evidence on
well,
that?
I think if Hunter Biden is guilty of something, then fine, convict him and send him
But
to jail. I think he's in
he's now
jail right
been
now.
convicted, hasn't he?
Yes, yes. So
But that
he
got
should.
suppressed. That got suppressed throughout Biden's
Well,
presidency.
that may have been, but it was obviously
All
found
I'm not suggesting Donald Trump hasn't done any of the things you're saying. I'm
I
just
think that
saying that if they
Biden hasn't pardoned his son either.
not yet.
No, not yet. I don't think he will.
All I'm saying is I think when I look at some of those politicians on all continents, if they all look in the mirror, what they'll see is themselves in everybody.
No, I agree. I think the defense is always that that we're all crooked, and therefore when your guy is crooked, it's okay. When the other guy is
Yeah,
crooked, it's not.
yeah.
I
I'm saying I
understand
think
that.
they're all slightly, without trying to get either one of us into trouble, they might not all be as straight as we would like them to be.
Of course, of course. I mean, I was born and raised in Chicago. Believe me, I understand that
Yeah,
politics is a blood sport,
yeah.
and I understand that. But I'm just not comfortable with the idea that the president is a king and that he can be allowed to do just about anything. I mean, I think if he went to trial for trying to overthrow a legal election, I think he would be convicted. And I think, the idea that everything is fixed against him is not true. Everything is in fact fixed
Mm.
for him. I mean, he's got the courts. He's I mean, trying to overthrow. They tried to impeach him for trying to overthrow the government, which I think he actually did try to do. And it's very difficult for me to understand that somehow this is the person we admire most in this country. Very difficult. But anyway, um, um,
My look at that is my reflection on
pardon?
why my reflection on why, if I look at it, is what's gone on in America in the last 4 or 5 years under the Biden administration, that everybody has felt it so bad that they're voting for Trump.
Do you have an idea?
No, because I'm not American. I don't live there. I'm not paying taxes there. Um, it's because there's a big difference when you go there and you're working somewhere, living somewhere, paying taxes, commuting
Yeah.
to and from work, putting a roof over your family's head, and
Well, the issue is we had this pandemic that the whole world had, the years
mm,
before that. I think that the argument against Biden was that we had high inflation. Well, I don't think we had as high an inflation as Europe did. The price of eggs are too high, and that somehow, if Trump was there, the price of eggs would somehow be less.
mm.
I
Again,
don't see
I
how
don't
that's
think I
going to.
think that's the
Well,
problem with media reporting. I think
right
that's
now, the Economist, which I think is a British magazine,
hmm
they tend to be fairly conservative. So we have at the end of 4 years of Biden, we have, according to The Economist, the American economy is the envy of the world. According to The Economist. That the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, has said that the American economy is the envy of the world. Now, if we had 4 years of Donald Trump, and the Economist and the IMF was saying the American economy is the enemy of the world, you'd hear a lot about that.
yeah.
Um, but we don't hear too much about that because the price of eggs went up, too high. Um, but I think the price of eggs, what were the price of eggs in England like in the past 4 years?
They've gone up.
Uh,
As a country, we're struggling massively.
okay. What are the price of eggs in France like these days,
It'll
or
be the same.
Germany?
It's in the same. I was in France. I was in France in
Right,
September. The prices have gone through the
right.
roof. I'm going over to Munich in a couple of weeks,
Right.
and the
Um,
prices in Germany and everything has gone
the
up.
inflation rate in the United States in the past year is, you know, what the inflation rate has been in the past year?
No idea.
2%.
Yeah,
2%. It's pretty good. So, you know, what we're saying is that, you know, Biden, by virtue of his being present during a period of inflation, that he is somehow doesn't know what he's doing, and Donald Trump would have done better.
mm.
However, we had a pandemic while Donald Trump was president, and we didn't blame him for that, for the pandemic.
No, we blame the Chinese.
Right. We blame the Chinese. And not only that, um, if you're a white American, you can beat up Chinese people in the street because, after all, China's responsible for the pandemic. And never once did Donald Trump say, don't do that, or you shouldn't do that, or it's not nice to beat up old people in the
but
street, blaming them for the pandemic, because it's not their fault, by
but
the
did he?
way.
But did he tell anyone to do it?
No, but
Because
he never spoke against it. There's a difference, I think, here. If you say, well, uh, people were beating up Chinese people in the street, and Donald Trump never said you shouldn't do that. Um, that's what we have to understand. That that's unfortunately how he operates. He doesn't say don't do that. If you do that, he doesn't speak against it.
you, but he did speak
You
out
have to
against.
you have to you have to admire him for being able to get away with that.
Yeah, but I'm a little bit confused because it's he's effectively the crime is because he didn't publicly say if you've beaten up a Chinese person you shouldn't do it.
Yes, I mean, I think a nice thing for him to do would be to say stop beating up Chinese people in America because they had nothing to do with the pandemic. I think that would be nice, especially for somebody who is a leader of, you know, massive numbers of people. I think it would be nice to say, for example, when Steve Scalise, I don't know if you know him, but I think he's a Texas or a Louisiana congressman. He was shot at a baseball game a couple of years ago while Trump was president, and he was shot by a person who had supported Bernie Sanders
Mm-hmm.
in his president. So Bernie Sanders at that moment says there's no place. So even though the guy was a Bernie Sanders supporter, Bernie Sanders says there's no place for violence here. So he came out, you shouldn't do this. This is wrong. I don't support that. But if somebody shoots somebody else, or tries to, you know, overturn the government or tries to interfere with the certification of votes, the president never says, don't, you shouldn't do that. That's un-American. That's violence. Violence in the service of Donald Trump is never, ever spoken against by him. And I think it
But
would
he
be a
did speak
nice
out again.
gesture. It
He
would be a
did.
nice gesture for somebody, for him to say that occasionally, don't you think?
But he has spoken out against white supremacy. He did that when he was president.
When?
He made an actual statement about both sides. He said there's good and bad on both sides when there was that big incident, and he got
Well,
edited. That was one of the things that CNN
that was
edited.
the speech. You know, that was the, no. I mean, I listened to everything he says. He says there were good people on both sides
Yeah,
during the riot in Virginia. You know, where
but
everybody
he
was
wasn't
marching in the
he
street
wasn't
saying Jews will not replace us.
yeah, but he wasn't supporting any one person, and he was highlighting the fact that you've got two groups of people and there's good people involved on both sides. And like I said to you earlier, one of the things that's difficult is we get so wrapped up in where we're not the same that we don't just invest a few minutes about where we are the same. And I read that Donald Trump is trying to say people, like, you realise the person that you're trying to fight against is from the same community as you. You're the same people. You shouldn't be fighting with each other. There's good on both sides.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's always good on both sides of most arguments. The problem was that this was a situation in which, people were marching in the streets saying Jews will not replace us, and I'm not sure what Jews have to do with any of this.
Yeah, but
I couldn't figure it out. Maybe you could, but I certainly had difficulty with that. So, marching, saying, blood and soil. I think, what Donald Trump has helped us understand is that um, it's not like we're having a different view of Donald Trump. I think we now have a better view of people like Adolf Hitler and all the good things that they did, thanks to Donald Trump and his supporters.
so
So I guess there is good people on both sides.
you're comparing Donald Trump to Adolf Hitler.
Well, I'm only saying, well,
Adolf Hitler tried to take over Europe and and effectively push for the genocide of the Jewish people in his country.
right.
Donald Trump definitely hasn't done that.
Have you seen? Have you? I don't know if you've been covering the news lately in the United States, but he just had nominated Matt Gaetz for Attorney General. Did you catch that?
I have, but I don't know who that chap is.
Oh, okay. Well, the nomination of Matt Gaetz for the Attorney General, the chief law enforcement officer in the United States, um, I guess you have to understand our history here a little bit more. But what that means was Donald Trump saying, "I can I can nominate Donald Duck for Attorney General, and you won't do anything about it." It
But
was
but,
something on that level.
but you've
And
compared a man who hasn't killed anybody to a man that killed millions of Jews and millions of people across Europe. All Donald Trump's done is won an election.
well, no, it's no. I mean, he's won two elections
Yeah,
actually.
but you've
So
compared him to Hitler, and Hitler started a war, a world war, and killed millions of Jews. He persecuted Jews, killed millions of Jews, and
but that was those were his bad points.
yeah, but you're comparing Donald Trump to him because Donald Trump just said that on either side of those riots were good people in those communities. And the problem is you're focusing on how you're separated and not what you have in common. Hitler wasn't trying to find any good in Jewish people. He was trying to find out if you were Jewish and then he'd kill you.
Well, he did a few other things. He took over the government in such a way that Donald Trump, for example, is saying that he is going to try, or at least is considering, taking away the licenses of TV and radio stations that criticize him.
No, deliberately lied about him. There is a difference.
Mm,
And when Elon Musk
Well,
released the Twitter files, he was
wait,
able to prove certain institutions made up lies about him.
well, that's a possibility, but you have to understand that anybody who's president, even Barack Obama, people made up lies
Yeah,
about
yeah, no,
Barack
I completely
Obama,
agree.
right?
I
People
completely
made up
agree.
lies about Joe Biden. People made up lies about George Bush, probably. I mean, I don't know. But I think there's a little bit of a difference when you say we're going to take away the licenses of people who lie about me. But Fox News last year got a $787 million judgment for lying,
Hmm.
for lying.
Yeah, yeah.
about the 2020 election. $787 million for lying. So in a court of law, it's been demonstrated that they actively lied, and yet no no threats of license being revoked. Isn't that odd?
Well, why would he threaten them when it hasn't happened under his presidency?
Because he's the president, he's going to be the president of the country. And if he doesn't like people lying, telling lies, then obviously that was a pretty big lie to
Yeah,
say
but
that.
he's so surely by that the criticism should be, because he's currently president elect and can't do anything, is the criticism should be that if when he becomes president, if he only targets certain news stations, that's prejudiced behaviour, and surely that's something that should be the court should throw out, because that would literally be the part about what you're talking about the difference between racism, tribalism, and prejudice. This is like, you're going after me just because I said things about you I don't like.
Right.
But currently, there's no example that that's his intention. His intention at the moment is if you've been found lying, your license should be revoked. But I don't believe he's actually said, well, he hasn't actually done anything about it yet. So at the moment, this could fall into his bluster of how he just likes to shout things from the hip.
Right. His bluster. Right. Yes.
Probably one of his.
We'll see.
Yeah, because probably one of his biggest faults is
he did try to replace the Attorney General of the United States, because the Attorney General refused to seize voting machines.
Yeah.
I see that as a little more serious than maybe other people, but that's just a quirk of mine. So I have these little.
So I find it funny that America doesn't have voter ID. Because in the UK,
Pardon?
I find it funny that America doesn't have voter ID. Because in the UK, you can't vote if you don't have your ID with you.
What don't we have? I don't get it.
You don't have to have voter ID in America. In some states in America, you can vote without voter ID.
Yeah, I don't know. All I know is the states that I have lived in, you need some kind of ID for sure.
I was watching a live clip on YouTube during the election, and two young men from Canada flew in, stayed overnight in California, walked into in Los Angeles, walked into a voting place with their Canadian passports, and were given permission to vote. And they voted. They filmed it.
I would need, before I would accept that, I would need to see that myself.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
But and the only reason I say that's I find things like that strange is because in the UK, if you don't have ID, your voter ID, you cannot vote.
Well, I'm pretty sure in the state of Illinois, if you don't have some type of ID, you cannot. You usually have to be, when I walk into a voting booth, I announce who I am and they look me up.
Yeah, same. So it's the same in the UK.
Here, vote. You walk in, you say, my name is, Anthony D'Agostino, and then they look up to see, do you live at such and such, and then they cross my name out, and then that's how we do it here.
Just for the record, again, I do not think that there was voter fraud in the last election. I don't, right?
But I don't either.
I have seen examples in the news where there was the rules were quite relaxed, let's say. And
I would say that I would need to take a look at that before I would accept that.
Just to be clear, I'm not saying
I used to live in California, by the way.
Yeah, for sure. Well, you live in America, so you're living it more than I do.
Yeah, I don't recall that, that I could just walk in somewhere and vote.
But all I'm saying is there were some examples from the election that Donald Trump lost, and I think he lost fair and square. I don't think there was voter fraud. I don't think it was rigged elections.
But what do you think the motive for, even to today, saying that he won the election by a landslide, you understand?
Because I said by demographic, not by numbers. But when you look at the red states now in America versus what it was, It's a
Yeah.
landslide. He's almost painted America red from the images that I've seen
Yeah.
of how many states are now under Republicans.
No, they're not under Republicans. He won Michigan, but Michigan is a Democratic governor. Michigan is a Democratic legislature. So no, it's just because he won the election in Michigan, that doesn't mean that the Republicans run Michigan. Sorry.
Let me see if I can find the picture.
No. I mean, I saw the same pictures you did. I mean, I do understand that, but um,
yeah, because it something. I don't think that's really entirely accurate, but wasn't it something like that?
yes.
Yeah, but I think it was. The problem is trying to find. So that's another one that came up. So this is the problem: is trying to find one that's actually accurate. Now, if I look at that across the geography of America, it's a landslide for Donald Trump. But that doesn't mean it's representation in numbers.
Well, but you also have to understand that in the middle of the country, like a
Yeah,
country like let's take Wyoming. Now, Wyoming has less than 1 million people. I think
yeah,
Wyoming,
exactly,
the
yeah.
big state, and Montana is a very large state.
Mm.
They have, I think, less than 1 million people. So you have to understand that the vast
Yeah,
majority of the middle of the country doesn't have the
but
population that has in some other
yeah,
places.
but that's what I
So
said at the beginning of the podcast. Is I'm not talking about when you look at the numbers, it's relatively close, but when you look at it
right,
across I said the word demographic,
right,
maybe the word geographic would have been better. Is
right. But you have to understand that the very large states like Idaho,
yeah,
Montana,
have
they have
less
very
than a
few
million people.
people.
Yeah,
Right. Now,
no,
it's
no,
like, like a state like Wyoming, for example, I think they have like under 500,000 people in the entire state, but they take up a lot of territory.
yeah, and California has something like a 30 million people live in it.
They have 40
Is it
million people in
40 million?
California.
Is it? So it's 40
40
million.
million, that's the most, 40 million,
Yeah,
and they only have two senators.
yeah,
They only have
exactly.
two
Yeah,
senators.
and this is this is
And
why I was saying is
Wyoming has under 500, I think 500,000 max, and they have two senators.
mm,
So, which is okay, but you have to understand that when you look at like red versus yellow, you
mm,
have to understand that not all
yeah.
these people live in the middle of the country, right?
No, but that's what I was trying to highlight at the beginning. Is just like when you look at it, and like I
Yes,
said, maybe I should have said geographically, not by demographic, but like you say, 40 million people in California, two senators. Less than
right,
a million in Wyoming, two senators. But when you
right.
look at the country across all of the states, and not
Yes,
right, it looks like a whitewash for Donald Trump.
it does. But I think you did very well. There's no question
Mm,
about it. But you have to also understand when you're looking at maps like
yeah.
that, you have to understand if you had in medicine, we have what's called a homunculus, where you get the image of the person based on
Hmm.
the amount of neurologic input. That's why you have this distorted picture. So you have to understand that if you had a map that went by population, it wouldn't look quite like that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
like I
yeah.
said. Um, I have another interview
No,
actually.
that's fine. We've overshot. We've
Wish I
overshot
would be
anyway
able
by
to
about
talk a
20
little bit
minutes.
more about my book, but I've enjoyed the conversation though. It's been very stimulating.
Just quickly again, just name the two books so people will know what to look for.
Well, the book is called Prejudice, Racism, and Tribalism, a primer for white people.
Perfect.
It's about those
Yeah,
topics.
no,
So
it's a lovely conversation, and thank you very much because we kept it very civil, especially in the areas where we don't see eye to eye, and
yes,
I
right.
genuinely really do appreciate it, and it's been a pleasure listening to you. So thank you very much,
And I very much appreciate you having me. So good luck. Best of luck to you.
and you take care, won't you? Have a great weekend.
Okay, thank you.
Bye. And there you go. It's interesting that I even have any knowledge or a discussion about Donald Trump. And again, I will say I don't have any skin in this game. I just see lots of obscurities on both sides. Both sides. I see the same in Europe. I see the same in the UK. And there's so much. It's getting so hard to see what the differences are and what the facts actually are. But we live in an interesting time, and I do think there were lots of interesting things that was discussed. And again, I'd love people to focus more on what we have in common. And I think even though we obviously towards the end we're on different sides of the spectrum, again, I don't live in America, I can't vote for anyone, but grateful that we managed to have a very civil conversation about it. And as I always say at the end of every podcast, thank you very much for your support. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And wherever you are from, whatever you believe, please do take care and be blessed. Thank you.